he has had to back off a bit, rethink his strategy, and he had to come down to the level of the people and realize that he cannot get back those hostages through military force. And so he went back to the truce, which was brokered through the US and through Qatar and through Egypt. And initially they've agreed on a 4-day truce. Each day, the resistance fighters, they release up to 10 of the Zionist hostages, and the Zionist entity, they release around 50 of the Palestinian prisoners that are held in the Israeli prisons, and it will mainly include women and children, and that's what the ceasefire includes at the moment. Now, they said it's 4 days or 5 days. What are the scenarios that we will expect next after the ceasefire? And this is where there's a few scenarios on the table, and it's very important for us to know where things might go over the next 4 or 5 days in order for us to know where things are going. And the various scenarios, we'll be able to know exactly where things are going in the next few days. We'll have a better picture, but here are some of the scenarios that we are up against. Number one, the first scenario is the most desirable scenario to how things have played out for the Zionist occupation on the ground in the previous 30 to 45 days. The first scenario is that the ceasefire will extend from 4 days. It will go beyond 4 days. Okay, they are open to extending the ceasefire, meaning that if they extend it another day, that means more hostages are released from both sides. And if it's going to 6 days, more hostages are released from both sides. The reason being is because once Hamas release 50 or so hostages, okay, that's not going to be enough for the Israeli public. They're going to say, we want the remaining hostages that are held by Hamas. Why should we stop now? And why should we go back to the war and risk the lives of the remaining hostages that are being held by Hamas? And especially that some families will have hostages that have been released and other families will have hostages that are still being held hostage. So they are going to complain and they are going to protest and hold Netanyahu to account and say to him, it's not fair that you release some hostages while others are still being held and you want to go back to the war. So we demand, as a people of the Zionist entity, we demand that you negotiate the release of all the hostages before going back to war if you want to go back to war. And so the first scenario is that he will succumb to the pressures by the families of the other hostages not released, and they will extend the amount of the days of the ceasefire in order to release more people from both sides, as Hamas or the resistance groups have also openly said that they are open to extending the days of the ceasefire in order for more of the Palestinian prisoners being released from the Israeli prisons and more humanitarian aid to be allowed into Gaza, more of fuel coming into Gaza, and this is open for discussion over the coming days. So as this plays out, once they have extended the ceasefire for the maximum amount of days and they've released a maximum amount of hostages, then there might be a long-term truce agreement made by both sides under the brokering of the US, of Qatar and Egypt as well. This will be the most rational scenario for the Zionist entity in order to reduce the number of casualties in its forces and to reduce economical loss and to reduce further divide in its cabinet and in the government, in the Zionist government. This is the most rational scenario, which is the most rational scenario for a statesman, for a government that cares about its people, that cares about its state, cares about where things are going, and has studied how things have been going in the past month in the war, that they've been losing on all fronts, and all they've achieved is killing of people and destruction and annihilation of the buildings and civilians and hospitals, and they have achieved nothing in terms of political objectives or military objectives. The most rational scenario is for them to accept the pressures from the US and to broker a long-term truce deal and not go back to the war under the Qatar and Egypt peace treaties, which are being proposed, which are being drawn up by the USA. That's the most rational. But we know that Netanyahu and his government are not rational, given how they've reacted so far. And so we go to the second scenario now. The second scenario is that we are now in a ceasefire, and then there's going to be an extension for a few more days in order to allow for the release for more Palestinian hostages and more Zionist prisoners. And then the war will resume on Gaza after both sides have reached the maximum amount of hostages and prisoners. And once the war resumes, it will be a stronger war, as the Israeli defense minister has mentioned, that it will be a stronger war, meaning the killing and the destruction of innocent civilian lives will be much bigger than what we've seen in the past 47 days. Civilian buildings and hospitals and infrastructure will be worse in the past 47 days, and the killing of the number of the people will be much higher. The reason being is because many of the hospitals that were once functioning in Gaza are no longer functioning. Especially in North Gaza, there is no hospital that is functioning at the moment. All hospitals have been taken out. And even the hospitals in South Gaza, many of them have stopped functioning. So that means if there is a resumption of war, injuries will most likely be turned into martyrs within a short period of time, because they do not have enough hospitals, enough medical teams, enough medical aid. And going back to the war again means the closing of the Rafah border. The third scenario is that after the 4 days of truce, so we do the 4 days of truce that has been agreed upon now by both parties, and it stops at the 4 days, there is no more extension to that, and then the war will resume immediately. And these two, what can we expect from these three scenarios that we spoke about? So the first one, we said it will extend to a long-term truce where there's no resumption of war, which is the most rational for the Zionist entity. So they reduce the amount of lives of their soldiers, reduce the economical loss, reduce the divide in the government. And then we said the second and the third scenarios is that after the truce ends, that Israel resumes its military operations in Gaza and resumes the genocide in Gaza. What can we expect? In our prediction, we predict that the Zionist entity, headed by Netanyahu, will resume the war in Gaza as soon as possible for the following reasons. Number one, Netanyahu currently stands at 27%, and his opponent, Gantz, stands at 48% in terms of popularity from the polls that have been shown in the Zionist entity's newspapers or news sources that came out today. Meaning that Netanyahu has lost public support and will immediately lose power if he stops the war. And most likely, he will face the court, him and his wife, and will end up in jail for previous court cases and previous crimes that he has committed. On top of that, what he has committed throughout this war. And the only way for him to maintain his position in power is to prolong the war for as long as possible and try to achieve some sort of political and military achievement through the war, in which he will seek to regain his public support from his people so he can maintain his seat in power. And we know that Netanyahu is a dictator, just like the Arab dictators. Regardless of what happens, he will try and maintain his position on the seat, even if it means killing off tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people, destruction, displacing of people, going against what his people, his own citizens want. Even if it means all that, he's willing to go that far in order not to lose his seat in power and not to end up in jail. And that's the type of person we are dealing with such a mentality. He is like a raging bull, as we've discussed before, as we've seen